I am a Christian, but I am against the practices that are known today as Christianity, because I have also studied history, and I have realized that there were several popes who called the first ones heretics. You could say, according to many original Christian historians, right, that they were the Ebionites, among other factions. What do you think about them? Do you think that the first century Judaism really had a Christian faction? Did they believe in Jesus?
This is one of the most intriguing questions, and there's a book about this written by Dr. Antonio Pinheiro, Defeated Christianities. That's his thesis, that when we talk about Christianity today, we assume that Christianity is like what we see today, Catholicism and its branches. But what people don't understand is that those come from one of the forms of Christianity that triumphed, which is basically the Pauline one and an interpretation of Pauline Christianity. But there were many more, like you mentioned, there were the Ebionites, there were Gnostics, there were the Ebionites, for example, that you brought up. They were people who, among them, many were Jews because the first Christians were Jews. Yeah, it's kind of funny. Honestly, someone commented something right before you started the broadcast, and they had said, is that the Jews have invented many things. They've invented the USB, the cherry tomato, the algorithms that allow you to see me now, the MP3 audio format, all these inventions by Jews, and Jews also invented Christianity. Did you know that? So what happened was that there was a group of Jews who were still like the Pharisee-style Jews, like that same tendency, and who followed the law. They used tefillin and talit, but believed Jesus was the Mashiach. So there was a group like that, and there were many more groups. I mean, you had mixes of mystery groups. Sorry, tell me.
There were roots of Christianity, many roots of Christianity.
There were many Christianities, but the Pauline interpretation prevailed.
The Hellenistic Pauline one, that's the one that prevailed.
Of course, that was the triumphant Christianity. So I'm not exactly sure what you mean, that you don't agree with the practices, but there are many today. There are also many Christianities. I mean...
Okay, but what's your opinion? I mean, exactly, about the Jews who really, I mean, Jews, right, in the cultural sense, who believed in Yeshua as the Messiah, as the Mashiach, because after the destruction of the Second Temple by Bar Kokhba, I think it goes with another kind of meaning, right? It draws more from oral tradition and shifts away from defining him as the Mashiach, distancing itself from Christianity when examining the Ebionites. Or maybe they didn't want to get involved in those political solutions. Because the term Mashiach,
it didn't make sense to crown Bar Kokhba as Mashiach if they already had a Mashiach, because, of course, that would contradict their faith and their group.
And now what I do myself. I mean, I read quite a bit from the Talmud or the Pirkei Avot treatises, and sometimes I take some situations from the New Testament. I refer to that because I feel if Jewish jargon isn't in the New Testament, it doesn't exist, because there wouldn't be any other way to interpret it.
Regarding that, I actually see it a bit the other way around, in the sense that, in fact, the first time I ever opened the New Testament in my life was when I was 26 years old, and I was very surprised by many things. I didn't know that was the narrative. And even to this day, after I've reread it several times and tried to get a better grasp of the New Testament, I see that it doesn't fit with Jewish tradition. No matter that there have been thinkers like Joseph Klausner and David Flusser, I don't see it fitting with Jewish thought.
What are your thoughts on John 1:1? Many interpret it as referring to two gods. When I consider the Hebrew perspective, in the beginning was the Logos, reminds me of Genesis, Bereshit, and I interpret the Logos as the Davar.
That's one of the typical arguments of missionary groups who say no, it's written directly in the Targum Onkelos.
No.
It mentions the Memra, understood as the word acting as an entity and as one of the three parts of the Spirit.
I don't believe in the sense that the Spirit is one person, the Father is another, and the Son is another, right? The term Ruach HaKodesh was created by Jews, but it doesn't mean that. Sometimes I use the example of Bayomer, which comes from the root Amares, as mentioned in the Pirkei Avot Tractate, with how many of those words is it said that the world was made. So I think it refers to the will of God, the will of the eternal.
It's something like that. Of course, it's something like that. It's the Memra.
I take that point to interpret it, right? Because I don't think it has to refer to the Holy Spirit as a divine person. Because even Catholics say that it's...
You're right. The Memra suggests that, but the Logos in John's Gospel does not. The logos in John's Gospel stems from Greco-Roman thought, including Platonic and Aristotelian ideas and concepts like the soul's parts and the chariots that pull it. One of these is the logos. The logos is part of Greco-Roman thought, and it's very characteristic throughout what John details in his work. That's why it doesn't fit to try to mix the Memra with the logos. So
How would you see it if the New Testament had been written in Hebrew?
if it had been written, there are many texts that were written in Hebrew that we don't consider canonical, like, for example, the book of Enoch in Spanish, which are they're very nice pieces of knowledge. It's like reading, I don't know, Plato's Republic. Like, they talk about very interesting things. There are other texts written by Jews that were not written in Hebrew, like Flavius Josephus, and that don't have as much of the Greco-Roman character as Flavius Josephus, but they were written in that language. But you can feel that it was written by a legitimate Jew with a way of thinking quite like that. But the New Testament, no, the New Testament, you can sense that that its origin isn't so. Although
There are some that do.
Matteo has a language that maybe one of the editors could have been a Pharisee. That is, the language he uses is Pharisaic. But among Matteo's 5 editors, the other 4 don't seem to be, based on how they include the quotes. I mean, and it seems to me that the sum is true. I mean, if it was a religion created by Jews, you have to have some Hebraisms, right? It's impossible not to, but in the total sum, for me personally, it doesn't fit. I understand that there are people like great scholars that have been, like Flusser and all those who say it fits. For me, no, it doesn't fit. There are others who say it doesn't fit, other scholars like Hayam Makobi and so on. But just so you know, that's my position. And about the school that believed he was the Mashiach, uh, I think what happened is that after the revolts, they got lost and it just couldn't be sustained anymore. Here it says Shops, Matthew to the Hebrew. It says House of Israel. Yes, the Catalan translated it into 14th century Hebrew.
It's interesting. Sometimes I read the New Testament and know some history. I noticed Yeshua was sometimes asked about topics like whether divorcing a woman was lawful. And he answers, in the case of adultery, only in the case of adultery, no. And there I read a bit about the rabbinical schools before Yeshua, before Jesus, which were those of Hillel and Shammai. They had different interpretations regarding the point of adultery, right? Or when a wife could be left. He seemed to lean more towards Shammai's view, which I think held that a woman could only be left for adultery. I mean, like,
Nope, this is another main argument used by Nazarene Messianic missionaries who tried to place Jesus in that role. Sometimes he agreed with Bet Hillel, other times with Bet Shammai. Here they quote the last halacha of chapter 9 in Tractate Gittin from the Mishnah. It's just that.
Yaakov, what's your historical perspective on this? Beyond missionary work?
Yes, I refer people to become familiar with both the Mishnah and the Qumran texts. And I have a video on the subject where I compare Jesus' stance on divorce with that of the Qumran sect. And you can see that he is closer to the apocalyptic Qumranites than to the views of Bet Shammai. So what missionary work does here is try to fit, to assemble a Jesus. That's my criticism, that they're trying to take sources from the Mishnah, particularly Pharisaic Judaism, and they say, look, here Jesus said something similar to Bet Shammai because Bet Shammai had a discussion with Bet Hillel about divorce. And since he said it wasn't allowed, then so they forcefully fit him into Bet Shammai, read the literature from that time. The Qumranites' view on divorce is closer to Jesus's, and many Essene practices resemble his more than Pharisaic ones. Galilean Judaism is not very explored in Western academia in Israel. There are more experts who have explored Galilean Judaism, and Jesus fits very well into that type of Judaism. That is to say, it is much more complex. It is the position of a historical Jesus expressing his views on Halakha, that is, on Jewish law. They are clearer if you know the whole Jewish framework. And that's why I think simplifying it by saying it's similar to Beit Shammai is something minor. It's something very typical of academia from 30 years ago.
What could happen? We're just talking about a first century Jew, right? I mean, I also think they had the knowledge. All Jews always followed that halakha. They didn't have that knowledge of that point of interpretations, or did they?
The Jew has always had the halakha. I don't think Yeshua was unfamiliar with it. I believe he made his own halakha. And that's why his group was different. It was revolutionary, precisely because of this, because he made his own school of thought. That's why I think let's say he stood out or he set himself apart from the other groups. But what I'm getting at is that we people often try to simplify and pigeonhole Jesus as either a Pharisee, a Sadducee, or an Essene. But it's more complex than that.
He wasn't just one of them, he had a bit of everything and believed in the resurrection and such.
He had little of everything. I think he was more Essene and even more Galilean, which sums up Jesus as a mix of both.
But do you think he was a Essene? Because I think the Essenes didn't associate with sinners. They didn't mix with those who were...
For many more reasons, yes.
Those who...
I invite you, the audience. I have a video on the topic, and look for, I don't know, Jesus Essenes, where I explain in a video that's almost half an hour long. The parallels that can be found between the literature of the New Testament. Academia they fabricated a historical Jesus from the New Testament, but to take him out of the factors of the New Testament that resemble the literature of the Qumranites, who are estimated to have been Essenes. There is discussion about this too, and that's the last thing I just said, that the figure of the historical Jesus is fabricated from the canonical New Testament of the four Gospels. But as you rightly pointed out, there were other schools of Christian thought. Academia tries to take the knee, which I find somewhat naive of the scholars, like trying to make up this imaginary entity, the historical imaginary Jesus, because there are three Jesuses, the Jesus of faith, the historical Jesus, and the real Jesus. No one truly knows the real Jesus. The so-called historical Jesus is just a figure scholars created. They take the Gospels and try to use the scientific method, and they try to apply certain methodologies to the New Testament to say that it's historical that he met John the Baptist, so it's historical that he was crucified. So they base it on filtering the New Testament, but as you mentioned, there were other traditions about who Jesus was.
Yes, but there are also there are historians who don't just look at it that way, but also in the sense of Flavius Josephus, of the original texts of the Talmud, which are Jewish texts, and of other texts as well, right? It's not just about the New Testament. I think that even if the Talmud mentions a Jesus, it's also something that can be corroborated, a historical Jesus. Or what do you think?
One example is that Josef Klausner, he dedicates an entire section to the Jesus of the Talmud, and there he begins to explain why the Jesus of the Talmud is not a historical section. He only breaks down two things: that there is a discussion with who is it? Shimon ben Shetach, who he mentions spoke with a Christian, and from there he takes a quote from Matthew 5:17. And Klausner also mentions that it is mentioned about the crucifixion or the death penalty during the eve of Passover. And this could suggest it's a historical fact, though possibly derived from the Gospels or the Talmud, which I think is more...
a shameful testimony of what it does.
Yes, while the Talmud is assessed differently now regarding the Flavian testimony, how much is interpolated and how much isn't. And the quote about the brother of the Lord, as they call him, Santiago in Spanish, Jacob, so, and about him, that he could actually be a historical figure. And you're right that they filter a lot, but the starting point is the New Testament. That is when scholars filter, and what you say is correct. They compare it with Tacitus, and Pliny mentioned this, and that Suetonius mentioned this, and they compare many texts. They do it under, what is the ultimate standard for scholars to measure by? The New Testament aligns with the parameters of the historical Jesus derived from it. If it passes that filter, it's a historical fact. If not, it isn't. You're right. They use... it's much more complex than the simplification I'm making, but the final measure and the filter were taken from the New Testament. That's why, for me, I think it's a lost cause. And it's just an exercise for those people who are still searching for their faith and are looking into history. And the historical Jesus is like this sweet intellectual candy that people... like a candy. A candy doesn't have any nutritional value, but it tastes, good, and you enjoy it. So people, in my opinion, who research the historical Jesus, that's nice, but it's useless. I wouldn't call it a waste of time, since it's valuable for many people. For many people, this determines whether they will continue to have their Christian faith or not. But it's
necessary, right?
For many, it's essential for their religious growth, no doubt.
Just like Bar Kokhba, it's necessary to know the history.
Everyone, did Hillel really exist? There are those who say Hillel didn't exist, that he's a literary creation. There are all kinds of opinions. Yes, the question is whether the historical exercise matters or what Christianity today it aims to be less apologetic and more sincere. Many Christians today say the historical Jesus doesn't matter. What matters are the consequences of Jesus and how that affects the life of the Christian, and whether this happened or not. And if the New Testament isn't historical, then it doesn't matter if it's a consequence. So, as you know, history keeps moving. Academia keeps refining how we conceive religions and how we conceive spirituality. That's fine. It's important.
A social process.
For example, it's part of what humanity is experiencing on this topic. Thanks for your input, Dario.
One last question before I go. I wanted to. I actually already saw a debate of yours with Indagando con la Verdad, all of that. I don't agree with him in many ways. He's a Mexican, I think. The one you had a debate with.
Okay.
There's something I wanted to ask you about because I disagree. It's precisely that he believes that really. I mean, the point of pregnancy comes from the New Testament. I mean, it's by God and in the Greco-Roman sense, right? But I mean, what I see in the Ruach HaKodesh is divine intervention. I don't see it as another God in my worldview. So what I see is that and according to the Ebionites, Yeshua was indeed the son of Joseph and the son of Miriam, because the tribal lineage comes from the father, not the mother. So he explains that actually no, that Miriam gives the tribal lineage and all that. But that's what I wanted to ask, is tribal lineage in Judaism only passed from the father? And what if it was a child whom people didn't know or didn't consider to be the child of two people? Would he go to a synagogue to read the scroll of Isaiah? Because according to Deuteronomy, which I was reading a bit, I think they didn't allow children who were bastards to enter. Right? So I take the testimony of the Ebionites, I take what Deuteronomy says about which people couldn't enter a synagogue, and I take into account at the point of who really legitimizes themselves in the tribal sense here.
There are many factors, and to sum them up in a single answer, no, the woman does not give tribe. Two, Deuteronomy doesn't mention synagogues because they didn't exist at that time. Three, we need to consider whether Jesus reading the Isaiah scroll is a historical event or not. It might be or might not be. For example, what Jesus reads, according to the New Testament, is a text from the Septuagint. Jesus, let's see, is in Judea reading the Septuagint in a synagogue. That's a scenario that can't be, right? There are several factors to question about its historicity, and I prefer not to be too explicit about the topic. But broadly speaking, no, the woman doesn't give.
It's that he would be reading the Septuagint because in a synagogue they read the Torah, not the Septuagint, right? I think the interpretations in the New Testament are in Greek because it was impossible for Pedro, a person who was also illiterate, to have been able to write with such fluency what we now see in Greek as it's written in the codices, right? Someone who is illiterate and lacks knowledge couldn't have written all that was written, so I don't think any of the apostles could have done it. They had the oral tradition like all Jews, and someone reinterpreted it in the New Testament as a Hellenized diaspora Jew would understand.
Yes, they are the gospel. They were called that, as you say, by tradition, by communities. And well, thank you, Dario, for participating, and let's keep delving into this.
What do you think about Christianities like that with an S at the end, plural? Christianities? Failed ones? I'm not sure what you mean.
Failed or defeated?
Defeated, sorry.
Yes, it's a book, The Defeated Christianities. It's a book, a work by Dr. Professor Antonio Pinheiro, which talks about how there wasn't just one Christianity. People usually have the idea that Christianity was a continuous line from Jesus to today's Christians. And today's Christian at home is convinced that he is the historical continuation of this Jesus. Then scholars, historians, philologists like Dr. Antonio Pinheiro suggest it's just an illusion. What was Christianities, these Christianities that developed throughout history, they begin to interpret what the event of the crucifixion was, or the events that took place there. And these Christianities develop in parallel communities, and in the end, few or one by one are defeated, and those are the defeated Christianities. Something like that, that's the idea. There's also a triumphant Christianity that denies its own triumph. There are also triumphant Christianities, but they are shaped by what is known as the heterodoxy of Christianity. As it is understood today, that's what defeated Christianities propose, that there wasn't just one idea. And I'll give you an example The Ebionites were one of these Christian schools that proposed a more Judaized vision, as it would be called in Christianity today. That is to say, they have more rituals like Shabbat, etc. It's a form of Christianity that was left behind, which is how they're passed down through history. That's what defeated Christianities means. I agree. It's accurate, and that's how it developed. Judaism undergoes a similar process with groups like the Sadducees and Pharisees. The Pharisees, who uphold the oral tradition, become the dominant form of Judaism.